Today we start a new history lesson. It's the beginning of theme 3 of our syllabus in Première. I have entitled this third theme France and Britain at the turn of the century, which is an expression that refers to the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th. And during this theme, which will consist in 2 lessons, I will do comparative history between France and Britain during this period, mostly focusing on politics at the domestic level, so 2 parliamentary regimes, and also, very importantly, the common fact that these 2 countries were also colonial powers at the head of very important empires, a process that would prove to have extremely important impacts on the world, just like their political history, because in continuation with what we studied of earlier periods in the 19th century, France and Britain were both at the vanguard of the modernization of politics. It is a lesson which is based on the French history syllabus, and the French syllabus normally requires a study of the regime, the new political regime called the Third Republic, that started in 1870 in France, and would take the First World War as an ending to this lesson, because it's indeed an important turning point. What is interesting in the first place is to see that there is no particular turning point in British history that would justify, apart from the OIB perspective, to start a lesson in 1870 for Britain. Indeed, it's a very important fact. There was no political revolution in Britain during the 19th century, no change in the regime due to any uprising of anything, but continuing democratization of the parliamentary monarchy. And in fact, it's an interesting thing to note that in British history, or more exactly the history of Britain, is often connected to the reigns of various kings or queens, and consequently historical periods are often named after the monarch. And so when our lesson will start in Britain, it's the middle of the reign of Queen Victoria, so one of the longest reigns, if not the longest ever, which justifies the fact that we talk about Victorian Britain when we study Britain in the second part of the 19th century, and a very long reign indeed, because it stretched up to the beginning of the 20th century. 1901 was the year of the death of Queen Victoria. Her successor was King Edward VII. So we often refer to the first decade of the 20th century in Britain as the Edwardian period. And by the way, the first decade of the 20th century in France, more exactly up to the outbreak of World War I, is often named La Belle Époque, in contrast with the tragedy of World War I. And just to get done with Britain, there was another monarch that got to the throne in 1910, George V, that would also reign for quite a long time. As an introduction to this general theme, I would like to point out that it was largely a time of convergence for the 2 countries. By this I mean that they were really following, if not similar, at least resembling paths. Both increased the democratization of their political regime, despite the differences in the form of the regime that you already know. Both countries were faced with social issues, and more exactly the social issues of the industrial age, which is also something we have already evoked in the previous lesson. And so basically in two countries the same question was raised, which was how to deal with the social inequalities that resulted from the industrialization in a capitalist economy, and how to deal with the demands of the new urban working class for more economic and political equality. A third convergence was the acceleration of the building of each country's colonial empire. Both colonial empires of France and Britain had a worldwide spread, and so clearly these two powerful European countries were in a competition for international power in those days. So there was a certain rivalry between the two countries, but, and that is my last point in the introduction, the period was marked by a historical diplomatic rapprochement. We can use this French term when we do geopolitics. So the rapprochement was a treaty signed in 1905, which went down into history under the name Entente Cordiale. So the French expression l'Entente Cordiale refers to a treaty of alliance between France and Britain, notably at the military level, which really put an end to centuries of rivalry. And the reason for the signature of such a treaty was the recent emergence of another competitor in Europe, which would prove to become a common enemy of both France and Britain, the young and increasingly powerful state of Germany. So this is the beginning of lesson 1 about political history in France and Britain. I've called it Parliamentary Democracy in the Making, and even though it will have a certain comparative dimension, I will first deal with France and later with Britain. The pictures that you can see on this slide are contemporary pictures of the Assemblée Nationale in France and the House of Commons in Britain. Two places of power which are at the core of each of these political regimes, certainly for these political regimes in those days, and the fact that they still exist today almost with the shape and decoration they had back in the 19th century is an illustration of the historical importance of the political changes that happened in these countries at the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th. So let's start with France, and so the big event of the late 19th century in France was the building of the Third Republic, whose birth was clearly difficult. This is the beginning of part A. And basically the reason why it was a difficult beginning was that the Third Republic was a regime born out of a military defeat, which is always a very difficult context for the building of a political regime. So just a quick reminder of France's political history since 1830. So we studied together that from 1830 to 1848 France was a constitutional monarchy ruled by King Louis Philippe. Then there was a short period of the very democratic Second Republic, which did not last long because it was overthrown by the coup d'etat of Louis-Napoléon Bonaparte, who created a regime called Empire, the Second Empire, which was much more authoritarian and which lasted in France from 1852 to 1870. Even though I said it was an authoritarian regime, and it was, but progressively during this period, the Second Empire became a bit more liberal in the way it functioned. Liberal, but not strictly speaking democratic. But it would be a long story. And so the Third Republic started in 1870, and this was almost only the result of a military defeat of France against Germany. A war between France and Germany, or more exactly the Kingdom of Prussia in those days, had started, and in fact the Kingdom of Prussia, so it's basically the state whose capital city was Berlin, was the state around which the unity of the German nation really took place, and in a way the war against France was the final stage in the process of the creation of the German state. And so as an emperor, Napoleon III was present on the front line, and he was made a prisoner after a military defeat around the city of Sedan on the 2nd of September 1870. It is illustrated on this little caricature here. 2 days later, the Third Republic was proclaimed in Paris, so on the 4th of September 1870, by the few, they did not have a majority, but the few deputies which were in favor of republic and who had been elected beforehand at the assembly, or one of the assemblies. The two most important names of the period are those of Léon Gambetta, who was probably the most famous supporter of the republican idea in France in those days. And he was rather left-wing, quite a radical politician. Adolphe Thiers was a much more moderate politician. He often played a role in the 19th century. You might remember that he was already there in 1830 introducing King Louis-Philippe because he believed the parliamentary monarchy would be all right for France. And well, he was a pragmatic man, and when Napoleon III was arrested, he had no problem in realizing that the Republic was now the only possible regime for France. So that's the reason why it was proclaimed. It was proclaimed because there was no other solution immediately. And despite this proclamation, the problems of France were far from being over, because Paris would soon be besieged by the Prussian army, and it was defended by the National Guard of Paris. You may remember that the National Guard had been created in the events of the French Revolution, 1789. And Paris in those days was surrounded by walls, you see. So, in fact, the Parisians were defending Paris against the Germans. Léon Gambetta went out of Paris in order to try and boost the morale of the French in the rest of the country, and really strengthen the military forces of France. And the new government was conceived as a government of national defense, which means that its most immediate goal was to fight the war. But eventually the new government was forced to sign an armistice with the Germans in January 1871, and it's on this occasion that France lost for the first time the departments of Alsace and Moselle. And this military defeat would immediately trigger a major event at the very beginning of the Third Republic. Today, by the way, we commemorate this year the anniversary of this event, which is known as la Commune de Paris, and which proved to be a very radical revolution only in Paris that ended up in a civil war. So why did such an uprising happen in Paris? In fact, what you must understand is that in the context of the beginning of the year 1871, Victor Hugo nicknamed this year l'année terrible. He was quite right. So in the early months of 1871, a breakup between Paris and the rest of the country took place. Indeed, politically, what was a matter of emergency was to elect a chamber of deputies that would give some legitimacy to the new republic. And so the legislative election took place in France, and the result was very particular because, as you can see on this graph, the result of this election was that the majority of the deputies of this first assembly of the Third Republic were in favor of monarchy. So it shows that the French had voted for very conservative candidates. Why such choice? Well, it's largely understood that in a context of great fear and defeat and desperation, the French, which was still largely a nation of farmers, turned to its historical protectors, the local elite in every village, in every department of France, and they often voted for the nobles of the area. And so many of these nobles were in favor of monarchy. It could also be the case of some bourgeois families that believed that the monarchy would be a more stable regime for a country like France. Most countries of Europe were still monarchies in those days. But Paris, on the contrary, had voted largely for Republican candidates, and you must understand that Republicans in those days were seen as very radical, very left-wing. So there was a disagreement. The head of government was Adolphe Thiers. He was a very moderate candidate, politician, I've already said, and his presence at the head of the government was a way to reassure the monarchists. He could be a man of compromise between republic and monarchy, if you see what I mean. One of the first decisions he made in the context of the war and of besieged Paris was to choose as the capital and the siege of the new government the city of Versailles, west of Paris. Strange decision indeed for a new republic, but a decision that could satisfy the monarchies who, I repeat that, were having a majority at the assembly. And he also decided to stop the funding of the National Guard in Paris because it did not confine in the National Guard. All these factors triggered a local revolution in Paris known as La Commune, and La Commune is represented at the top of this row of historical characters piled upon each other here. So the uprising happened in March 1871. After the government of Thiers, which the rebels called the Versailles government, ordered the National Guard of Paris to hand over the cannons to give up on their arms, actually. And the National Guard and many Parisians refused this order, and they made an insurrection. Paris was covered in barricades, and they made local elections in Paris and proclaimed an independent commune of Paris. And it was a political and social revolution based on a very left-wing ideology for these days. Indeed, principles such as freedom of speech, such as separation of the church and the state, gender equality, so between men and women, the idea of a right to work, the idea that there should be no unemployed people and that the state should provide for them in case of necessity, the choice of the red flag as a symbol, all these elements were extremely left-wing according to the politics of the time. One famous character of the Commune was the female activist Louise Michel. She was a teacher, and she defended what we would call today feminist ideas. She was very left-wing and known as the Red Virgin of Montmartre, sometimes as a kind of romantic nickname. What you must understand is that this Commune de Paris was totally rejected by the national government, and in fact it was also rejected by most of the French citizens who were scared of the news they received from Paris, notably because there was a lot of anti-communard propaganda describing them as savages and so on. The Commune lasted for 3 months, and it was ended by a total military crackdown in May. A week known as La Semaine Sanglante proved to be a week of civil war between the communards and the army of the national government, which went down in history as les Versaillais. Around 10,000 communards died. 10,000 others were convicted and received either the death penalty or were condemned to deportation. It was a long week of military fights in the city of Paris, as you can see on this map. From the west to the east, during 1 week, the Versailles troops progressively regained terrain in the capital, and eventually the communards were prisoners between the army of the French government and the army of the Prussians in the east. And it ended with as I said, the arrest of most communards. Louise Michel, for example, was condemned to deportation in New Caledonia in the Indian Ocean. And yes, the communards were really presented by the government as extremely dangerous people that deserved to be killed. There was a political message in the great violence by which the army of the new government destroyed the Commune de Paris. The message was that the new republic would not be a socialist one. It would not be left-wing. It would preserve the order. It would preserve the domination of the bourgeoisie. And so that was a way to reassure most of the French, because most of the French again were anxious about this revolutionary mood in Paris. But in fact, after the Commune and during most of the decade of the 1870s, the political question was, would the new regime even be a republic? The return of monarchy was at one point largely possible, and eventually it failed. So there were some paradoxical events that took place in the early days of the Third Republic. For example, the first president of the Republic, elected in 1873, a marshal of the French army called MacMahon, he was not in favor of the Republic. He was a monarchist. He had been elected for 7 years, a long mandate, which proved that the regime was searching for some stability, and that the monarchist deputies wanted to gain time in the hope of a restoration of monarchy. But actually, this restoration of monarchy failed, because, as you can see on this drawing, after the collapse of the Second Empire, there was a rivalry between two political groups that both wanted monarchy, but that did not want the same monarchy. On the right side of this drawing, you can see a man carrying a white flag, and he represents the man that could have been King of France, and his name was Comte de Chambord. But he demanded the white flag, and he demanded a return to very traditional monarchy, because he was the descendant of the Bourbon family. And his supporters were known as the Légitimistes. They were the most conservative monarchists possible, and in practice they wanted a return to the era of the Restoration, so from 1815 to 1830. And very symbolically, they rejected the idea of keeping the blue, white and red flag. But on the other hand, and on the other side of the cartoon, you had also the Orléanais, who were supporters of the Orléans family, that is to say the family of King Louis-Philippe, who had reigned over France during the July monarchy from 1830 to 1848, and who wanted a more modern, more constitutional and even parliamentary monarchy, a bit the English way. They would have accepted the tricolor flag because it was the flag of the monarchy of July. And eventually, due to this division, no camp managed to take over, and eventually the Orléanais progressively turned to the Republic because they saw that it was the only possible solution. So the Third Republic never had one single constitution. It was built by a series of laws known as constitutional laws, so more progressively, and that were voted not in great enthusiasm. Around the year 1875, they settled the institutions of the Third Republic, creating, as you can see on this chart, a bicameral regime with a parliament called Assemblée Nationale and composed of two chambers, a chamber of deputies directly elected by the people, and a Senate indirectly elected, so more conservative, in order to stabilize the regime. The regime would be a parliamentary one in the sense that the government had to be supported by the assembly and could be overtaken by the assembly, or more exactly overthrown by a negative vote. So the government needs the support of the parliament to govern. The parliament represents the nation, and this is how you have a parliamentary monarchy. At the beginning, the powers of the President of the Republic were seen as rather important. He notably had the right to dissolve the Chamber of Deputies and so call for new elections, which is also, by the way, a power of the British Prime Minister. And in fact, one last political crisis took place in 1877, known as the crisis of the 16th of May. Though the President of the Republic was Maréchal MacMahon, he was a supporter of monarchy. But in 1876, after a new legislative election, the National Assembly was now dominated by Republicans for the first time, and MacMahon was worried about that. What he tried to do was to use his power, his right to dissolve the Assembly, and he did so on the 16th of May 1977. But again, the French voted in favor of the Republicans in majority, even giving a larger majority to the Republicans. And for that reason, Léon Gambetta, that you can see represented as a little puppet, a little toy on this drawing, insisted that now for the president it was time to accept the new situation or to go. And eventually, 2 years later, when the Senate in its turn became dominated by the Republicans, President MacMahon left office, and it was now clear that the Republic would survive and that it would be a very parliamentary monarchy, because never again, by tradition, would the right to dissolve the Assembly be used by a president of the Third Republic. In 1879, after the resignation of MacMahon, the first truly Republican president of the Third Republic was elected. His name was Jules Grévy.